They fought under the American flag, bled on European soil, and came home as the most decorated military unit in the entire history of World War II. But when they returned, they couldn't eat at the same lunch counter as the men they had fought beside. Their medals meant nothing at the voting booth. Their sacrifice meant nothing at the door of a whites-only diner. And for nearly 7 decades, the United States government acted as if these men had never existed at all. The story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team is one of the most extraordinary and most buried chapters in American military history. These were Japanese-American soldiers, many of them the sons of parents who had been stripped of their homes and locked behind barbed wire by the very government these young men were now being asked to die for. And die for it they did, in numbers and with a ferocity that left battlefield commanders stunned and historians scrambling for superlatives. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japanese Americans living on the West Coast became targets of a fear so irrational and so politically convenient that President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, forcing over 110,000 people of Japanese descent into internment camps. These were American citizens, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, children. They lost their homes, their businesses, and their freedom without trial, without evidence, and without apology for decades. But here is where the story takes a turn that no Hollywood script would dare make up. Thousands of the young men sitting behind those fences volunteered to fight. They asked to serve the country that had just imprisoned their families. Some enlisted from inside the camps themselves, filling out forms with barbed wire visible through the window. The question on the loyalty questionnaire asked if they would serve in the armed forces of the United States. A staggering number said yes. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was officially activated in February 1943, and it was composed almost entirely of Japanese Americans, known as Nisei, which means second generation. Alongside them was the 100th Infantry Battalion, nicknamed the Purple Heart Battalion, even before the two units were formally combined, because casualties came so swiftly and so heavily in the brutal fighting across Italy. These men walked into some of the most ferocious combat the European theater had to offer, and they walked in knowing their families were prisoners back home. They fought at Anzio. They clawed their way through the Gothic line in northern Italy. They liberated the town of Bruyères in France, where the locals remembered them so vividly that decades later, French school children were still learning their names. They fought in the Vosges Mountains in conditions that career soldiers described as among the worst of the entire war. Snow, mud, near vertical terrain, and a German army dug into every ridge and tree line. It was in those Vosges Mountains that the 442nd accomplished what became their most celebrated rescue, an operation that burned their name into the consciousness of anyone who ever heard it. The 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, a Texas unit, had been cut off behind enemy lines. They were surrounded, running low on ammunition and supplies, and their situation was deteriorating by the hour. Command after command sent units in to break them out, and unit after unit failed. Then, the 442nd was ordered in. What followed was 5 days of some of the most brutal, close-quarters combat of the war. The 442nd punched through the German lines at enormous cost to themselves, losing far more men than the 200 or so Texans they were rescuing. They did it anyway. When the rescued soldiers emerged from the forest, many of them wept. The men who saved them had done so while their own parents sat in internment camps a continent away. By the end of the war, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team had earned more than 18,000 individual decorations. They received 9,486 Purple Hearts. They were awarded 21 Medals of Honor, though many of those were initially downgraded due to racial bias, and only upgraded to their proper status in the year 2000, after a Department of Defense review found evidence of systematic discrimination in the original award process. For a unit of their size and length of service, no other American combat unit in history has matched their record. And yet, when these men came home, the welcome they received was a window into the ugliness that America had not yet confronted about itself. In some parts of California, Returning Japanese American soldiers were told their families' farms had been seized, businesses were gone, neighbors had taken over properties. Some veterans were turned away from veterans-only establishments because of how they looked. One returning soldier in California was reportedly refused a haircut in the town near the base where he had trained. He had just spent years fighting fascism in Europe. The government said little. The story was not taught in schools. It was not commemorated in monuments. The men of the 442nd grew older in relative silence, their extraordinary service acknowledged occasionally, but never fully absorbed into the national memory in the way their record demanded. It took until 2010 for Congress to collectively award the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor in the United States, to the veterans of the 442nd, the 100th, and the Military Intelligence Service Japanese Americans who served in the Pacific. There is something in this story that cuts to the bone of what it means to belong to a country. These men were told in every possible way that they were not truly American. The law said it. The signs on doors said it. The barbed wire said it. And they still went. They fought anyway, with a ferocity and a loyalty that the country did not deserve from them. And they came home to find the walls still standing. The least we can do, the absolute least, is know their names.